What's the only thing that there's just too little of? It's not Love Sweet Love, but podcasts, sweet podcasts. And the latest former politicos to join the content churning conveyor belt, it's former Chancellor and former Shadow Chancellor George Osborne and Ed Balls. The pair have announced a yet to be titled weekly podcast, which promises to bring economics back to life. The show is billed to launch this autumn and will be produced by the same production company responsible for the newsagents. Balls and Osborne have been puffing up their credentials as political opponents, or in the former Chancellor's words, as frenemies. Osborne tweeted this: "If you told me 10 years ago I'd team up with Ed Balls, I'd never have believed you. But life is full of great surprises. This autumn, my frenemy and I will bring you a podcast that will explain how political decisions are really made and explore the big economic questions we face." Bitterest enemies turned firm friends. It's enough to warm the cockles of your heart. The show's PR blitz leans hard into the idea that these men are polar opposites, chalk and cheese, Schwarzenegger and DeVito. They promise to reach across the political divide and show, through the power of reasoned debate and cozy banter, that politics doesn't have to be so polarizing after all. But are these men so different in the first place? Ed Balls was George Osborne's shadow cabinet counterpart in the years when Osborne was Chancellor of the Exchequer. Balls had served in government under Gordon Brown and lost his West Yorkshire seat when the Conservatives won their majority in 2015. As you may remember, Osborne's time in Number 11 was defined by a brutal programme of austerity. His cuts took £37 billion out of the benefit system, causing child poverty to spiral to 4.2 million kids last year. He introduced the bedroom tax, the two-child limit benefits cap, and in 2016, he tried to force through cuts to disability payments in order to pay for a tax cut to the middle classes. One study published in the BMJ found that George Osborne's austerity policies were linked to 120,000 excess deaths in 2017. Now, you would hope that a Labour shadow chancellor between 2010 and 2015 would be putting up a principled and implacable fight against George Osborne's austerity policies. Well, not quite. It really wasn't long into the coalition government that Ed Balls began to happily parrot Tory economic ideas. This is from a 2011 Guardian report. Shadow Chancellor Ed Balls will attempt to begin restoring Labour's credibility on the economy by promising that before the next election, he will set out demanding and independently scrutinised fiscal rules for cutting the deficit. He will also tell his party conference in Liverpool that if there is any windfall from the sale of state-owned bank shares such as RBS, the cash will be used exclusively to pay down the deficit and not boost state spending. Adopting a more hawkish stance on the economy, Balls will say, "We will never have credibility unless we have the discipline and the strength to take tough decisions." So instead of using money from nationalised assets to invest in education, hospitals, transport, or welfare, Ed Balls adopted the Conservatives' totally arbitrary line on deficit reduction. When it came to borrowing to invest during an era of historically low interest rates, Shadow Chancellor Ed Balls and Chancellor of the Exchequer George Osborne were of one mind. Here's a New Statesman piece from 2014. Balls binds Labour to austerity with promise of no extra borrowing. George Eaton goes on to explain Ed Balls' screeching U-turn. Having pledged to eliminate the current account deficit rather than the total deficit, in contrast to George Osborne, Balls had left himself with room to borrow for capital spending, such as housing, roads, and other infrastructure projects. But as a spokesman for the Shadow Chancellor confirmed to me after the speech, he has now ruled out this option. "We will not make proposals in the manifesto for extra capital spending paid for by borrowing," I was told. Policy commitments, such as the pledge to build 200,000 houses a year by 2020, will be delivered by prioritising housing investment within the existing capital settlement for the next Parliament. Having rejected the option of extra borrowing, Labour will now need to meet all its promises through tax rises or spending cuts elsewhere. Austerity really is here to stay. And in case you were hoping that Ed Balls was at least going to promise that a Labour government would repair the damage wreaked by the Conservative coalition's austerity measures, tough luck. This headline shows his response to the Tory budget in 2015. Ed Balls admits Labour would not reverse George Osborne's flagship measures. The Telegraph article says this. Speaking in response to yesterday's budget, he said nothing had changed because the Chancellor had produced a quite empty budget, meaning Labour wouldn't need to reverse any of it if the party was successful at the general election. There's nothing I need to reverse. What I will reverse are deeper spending cuts in the next 3 years than the last 5. So this idea that Ed Balls and George Osborne are ideological opponents is total fraff. They were political rivals for power, but what they wanted to do with that power was broadly the same. They're two individuals who may as well be the poster children for disenchanted voters shrugging their shoulders because all politicians are the same. George Osborne and Ed Balls occupy places on the political spectrum that aren't even in different postcodes. They're inches apart. So this podcast isn't so much the odd couple as it is the Olsen twins. They're two sides of the same economic orthodoxy, two cheeks of the same austerity-happy arse. So why are they doing it? Well, it's quite simple. They want to restore their tattered reputations so that they can wield political influence again. And look, I hate to say I told you so. That's a lie. I love to say I told you so. But this is what I had to say last month about the best way for ex-politicians to launder their reputations. Start a podcast. Everybody loves a parasocial relationship. And there's nothing like the easy familiarity of podcasting to cultivate a cuddly, avuncular persona, chuckling away any inconvenient suggestions of accountability. Alistair Campbell is the MVP of British political reputation laundering. His reinvention as a thoughtful grandee of sensible politics, honesty, and integrity is up there with Henry Kissinger's Nobel Peace Prize in terms of grotesque irony. Here's the man who captained Tony Blair's spin machine in making the case for the invasion of Iraq, including pushing the falsehood that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction capable of reaching the UK in 45 minutes. And more than anyone else in the UK, he's credited with the invention of spin, the shaping of the news agenda to better suit your own political objectives at the expense of, stupid shit, like telling the unvarnished truth in the public interest. Eventually, your political rehabilitation will be so complete that you can start a podcast opining on all things political without having to reflect on your own role in causing the very problems you describe. Because hey, why should a few dead Iraqis get in the way of a highly successful media career? You can see why George Osborne and Ed Balls, whose names are synonymous with austerity and Labour's decline in the Red Wall respectively, would be keen to reinvent themselves as centrist grandees. It means people focus less on your many, many failures and instead begin to think of you as a glowing exemplar of a more decent age. This appeals primarily to an audience that didn't really get affected by austerity or rent increases or student debt, but really hated Brexit because it offended their sense of who should make political decisions. And I'm not talking about all Remainers here. I'm talking about the people who thought that staying in the EU was more important than tackling economic injustice. What podcasts like this also do is narrow the range of acceptable political opinion. So the debate isn't between the left and the right anymore, it's between the so-called centre and the right. It closes the door on political and economic change. No need to worry about socialism anymore, lads. It's back to the two flavours of corporate social responsibility. That sound you hear? It's the Overton window slamming shut. It also helps that there's big money to be made in the centrist dad market, as The Guardian's Jim Waterson points out by writing this. New podcasts with large, loyal audiences are highly attractive to advertisers, giving access to a wealthy audience who are increasingly hard to reach through other means. and are happy to buy tickets for live recordings and spin off merchandise. As hosts of their own podcast, Balls and Osborne will expect to receive a large cut of any advertising revenue the show produces. Nice work if you can get it. So, Sean, do you think that the centrist dad market can comfortably absorb a knockoff of the rest is politics, or are they oversaturated?
It depends how much of a continued appetite there is. I'd say one thing about the rest is politics is that I think reviews tended to agree that it did best when the two men speak personally, because there is some fascination, perhaps it's the thick of it factor with Alistair Campbell, and Rory Stewart has always been considered classic sort of right-wing Tory eccentric. I don't know that necessarily these two participants have the charm. Yeah, it's about why there is such an appetite. And I think it's an extension of how we consider political commentary in this country due to the media. I think it's worth saying that there's certain aspects, and I'm aware that you and I are doing political commentary right now, where it's a rather cozy affair and people don't actually want to be challenged because it's light entertainment. A lot of mainstream broadcasting treats politics, particularly parliamentary politics. And I think there's also a sense of creating, with a podcast, a self-regarding community who feel like they are very intelligent and they are listening to a discussion that is in no way threatening to their perhaps core political beliefs, but certainly is there to slightly affirm their sense of being part of a club. And there's a sort of register to that. I don't think it's always podcasts. I would say, for example, the popularity of Marina Hyde's columns, for example, is that this tends to be political commentary where the focus is on affirming the sense of intelligence that you understand the references or jokes in the commentary itself, rather than, and there will be this sort of words like searing used, when in fact it's not that searing at all. And actually it comes across to anyone perhaps on the left as quite soft serve. The other thing I was going to say is, and you touched on this, is that this is also does contribute, I think, in this country to reframing what we even think of as left wing. Another example would be the New Statesman released its left power list. As I know you're aware, Ash, the names gracing it were Keir Starmer, West Streeting, J.K. Rowling. I think to anyone on the left, that was somewhat baffling. But I think it's about, again, as you say, the Overton window, about where the centre of gravity is in our political discourse, at least that allowed by popular media and funded in expensive, shiny new podcasts.
Is there also an element of the death of shame? Because I thought this when Amber Rudd started doing a podcast with her daughter, Flora Gill, and I think this about Alistair Campbell doing a podcast, and I definitely think this about George Osborne, which is, if I used my time in power to corrode public life so disastrously, to pick on vulnerable people so mercilessly, I would be afraid of leaving my house for fear of being pelted with rotten fruit, let alone going on a podcast to be like, aren't I someone worth listening to? Like, is there something which is like self-comforting about this? By doing this, they can trick themselves into believing that they've been good people in public life.
I don't think there has actually been a death of shame. I think if you look institutionally, what we have done is we have always given former politicians, access to the unelected House of Lords. We've given them titles. We've given them imperial honours. There is a sort of like establishment belief that just by having occupied a role of power, and they believe it's public service, regardless of what you've done in that role, that you're entitled to some kind of benefit on leaving and some kind of deference and respect. And I think this is just a modern iteration of it. They're not just happy to settle for like Baroness or Lord anymore. They also want, I don't know, to be popular, to be a figure in light entertainment. I mean, famously, the adage that politics is show business for ugly people. I feel like that for some politicians, Ed Balls did Strictly Come Dancing, and by the way, I'm not calling Ed Balls ugly. I think that some politicians very much enjoy the idea that in retirement they get to assume this position of almost reclining and getting to participate in entertainment with the kind of authority that comes from having occupied a ministerial role, full stop, regardless of what they've done. And I think, again, that's a failure of our political culture and media culture to hold people to account. So, no, I don't think it's the death of shame. I think it's a continuation of shamelessness, but just in a modern iteration.
I mean, I think you're totally right about that avuncular persona, right? You half expect them to like get out a little packet of Werther's Originals than tell you about the time they took half a pill at university.